we talked quite a bit about the words and the meanings leg of the triangle that I mentioned up front, and particularly with respect to the notion that words don't mean. People provide the meaning for words. Dictionaries provide definitions, but the day-to-day meanings of words are found in the context and the people who use the words. Two quotes that I'd like to refresh your memory. Charles Sanders Peirce, who said, "You don't get meaning, you respond with meaning." And then the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Percy Bridgman said, "The true meaning of the term is to be found by observing what a man does with it, not what he says about it." And it's important to remember this notion, or this distinction between a dictionary definition of terms or words versus the meaning, the individual meaning that individuals apply when they're using those terms. Now, from the standpoint of how this applies to you as a journalist, as a public relations professional, as an advertising copywriter, we talked about various things throughout the semester, and what I'd like to do is just summarize those on 2 pages here of 10 points. The first has to do with differentiating fact from opinions, or fact from inferences, or facts from beliefs. And the 3 criteria that we learned from Irving J. Lee, which admittedly sets a pretty high bar for what we consider to be fact. But remember that the consequences of mistaking an inference as a fact is much greater than if we were to treat what's normally accepted as a fact as an inference. So when in doubt, accept something or hold on to something more tentatively as a belief, as opposed to a firm fact that everybody ought to see the same way. But his 3 criteria for a fact were that you can only make a statement of fact after there's been some kind of an observation or experience. You can't make a predictive statement that would be factual about something that hasn't happened yet. Facts don't go beyond what the observation is. So facts don't go to things like motivation or intent. Facts stick with what was actually observed or what happened. And then the third thing is that facts are as close to certainty as possible. And the criteria that Lee used was, would you bet your life on it? Otherwise, you're dealing in the realm of probability, which has much more to do and should be treated more as an inference or as a belief or an opinion or assumption as opposed to a fact. We talked about that in this particular type of outlook point of view, that we recognize shades of gray. We try to look at evaluations on a continuum from not so appropriate to very appropriate, from not so good to not so bad, as opposed to clear-cut either or, right, wrong, black or white choices. Because for the most part, what we encounter in our daily living is somewhere in the middle, can be perceived on a relative scale. We also want to look for multiple causes. We have a very interconnected, interrelated world of experience, and it's very simplistic, especially when you have something so complicated as some kind of an accident or some kind of an event, whether it's positive or negative. It's simplistic to look for the cause, but be thinking about it in terms of what are the multiple causes of what resulted in the particular event. Remember that it's important that to recognize that we each experience things by our own nervous systems. We're limited in what we can experience. So we need to maintain this attitude of to-me-ness. So whatever you view a movie, you have a reaction to a particular musical group or hear a particular song, whether you like it or not, remember that your taste, your criteria, your evaluation means are all a part of your own personal evaluating process. We talked probably a lot more than you would like to have talked about the 2 kind of methods of changing language or revising your language. The first having to do with English minus absolutes, which is trying to minimize inappropriate usages of absolutistic terms such as all, none, best ever, totally, absolutely, without a doubt, etc. And then also to avoid the to be crutch, the verbs to be, the verb forms of to be, such as is, am, are, were, etc. maybe we didn't talk about some of these other things so much, but I did want to at least mention them. Number 7 has to do with how we have a tendency to want to objectify processes and treat them as nouns, as if they were grammatical forms of nouns. So we can talk about things like the weather or the economy, or something very high and abstract, generalized and abstract, like truth or justice. We talk about them as if they were something tangible, as if they're a noun. So we need to be aware when we're doing that, so that we recognize that what we're talking about when we're talking about truth isn't nearly as distinct and concrete and exact as when we're talking about something like a table. Please take responsibility for your own actions, and when you're describing how you felt about something or how you reacted to something, don't be afraid to use the personal pronoun of I. Don't try to generalize your experience as, well, you know, when this happens, the first thing that you think about is you want to run home to mama. Well, take responsibility for your reactions. Talk about it in terms of I. Don't presume that everybody would react the same way as you. And by the same token, take responsibility for your actions, and don't try to project your own feelings or your own emotions onto somebody else or someplace outside of yourself. For instance, if you're having a fight with your boyfriend or girlfriend and you say, they hurt my feelings, or she hurt my feelings. Well, to be a little bit more specific about it, to be a little bit more appropriate in terms of what actually happened, she said something, I interpreted it, and my feelings felt hurt, or I hurt my feelings, as opposed to saying, to giving the power or to giving the responsibility over someone else. And then finally, I continue to be able to look for similarities within differences, but also look for differences within similarities. And don't fall victim to the typical generalization error of presuming that one item or one data point or one representative can be fully descriptive or fully representative of an entire class. So, in other words, don't say we need to get a woman's point of view, so we need to invite a woman to be on this particular team. Or we need a Muslim attitude, or we need to have the perspective from a Buddhist. Don't presume that one person can represent an entire race or gender or religious group, one sorority, one fraternity, one member of a particular class. Recognize that there are differences even amongst those things that we classify similarly. Now, the one area of the 5 that we didn't talk about very much had to do with sensory awareness. And this has to do with recognizing that we experience life on nonverbal or on the sensory level. One of the examples that I gave was, would you rather have a piece of chocolate, or would you rather hear someone give the best example or the best description of what chocolate tastes like? Unless you're on a diet, you'd probably rather have the actual chocolate. So we actually live life on sensory levels, and then we talk about those experiences. And it's important, I think, that to recognize that and how we talk to ourselves can influence the way that we behave or we react physiologically, neurologically. So you think about times when you're particularly stressed. What does it take to get you down from that stress or to reduce the anxiety? Chances are it has to do, to a large extent, on how you talk to yourself, on how you process the stress of whatever the activity is that's causing the stress, whether it has to do with the deadline or whether you're worrying about how you're going to do on a particular final. These things represent the process of evaluating that's going on between your ears. So recognize that what's going on physiological levels is influenced by how you talk to yourself, which is, of course, part of a cognitive physiological process. But a couple of examples that we did in class will maybe help remind you about the role or about the possibility that you have of misevaluating on nonverbal or sensory levels. And we had 2 particular visual exercises, the dimples and bumps experiment and the counting the black dots, which show that your visual systems, your eyes and your visual cortex, have the opportunity, have the possibility of fooling you, probably more so we would like to admit. Now, this is a slide that I put in here, not so much specifically for you, but for a presentation that I'd given to some AP English teachers a few weeks ago. But in terms of some of the benefits, I hope you might agree or at least consider that after studying general semantics and applying it on a fairly conscientious basis, that some of the benefits you might perceive would be to maybe become a little bit more tentative and a little bit more uncertain in your daily experiences and evaluations, so that you're maybe a little bit more inquisitive, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, particularly for a student, particularly for somebody just starting out in a career. Where if you're tentative, a little bit uncertain, you ask questions, you don't take things for granted, and I think that's the kind of employee that anyone who's running a newspaper or a broadcast studio or a public relations firm or advertising company would be looking for. They're not looking for somebody coming out of college who has all the answers or who's definite about what's right or what's wrong or what's good or what's bad, but they're looking for somebody who's more or less impressionable from the standpoint of asking questions and looking for new information and being willing to accept new inputs. I would hope that you would also be much more conscious of the difference between when you're describing something versus when you're making an opinion of something. So this distinction of making descriptions at the level of the structural differential as opposed to making inferences, being aware of those differences. You'd also recognize that you would have the opportunity to make more unique observations and see things a little bit differently as opposed to just seeing what everybody else sees. And so you'd be relying less on resorting to cliches or conventional wisdoms or the kinds of stock phrases that you hear nowadays. I would hope that your abilities to describe and to relate your experience would be more unique and be more particular to you individually and reflect more of your own individual self. I would hope that, as I've said, that you'd be more discriminating of similarities within differences as well as looking for differences amongst things that are similar. So it's both the ability to see the forest and see the trees. One of the aspects of this that I think may be overlooked is that the more that you get into this, the more humbling it is to recognize how little you do know and how little you can know, and how, again, relating back to the tentative and uncertainty, have to recognize a little bit of humility in your ability to know or to learn, which shouldn't necessarily affect your motivation, but to just recognize that maybe you shouldn't be expected to know it all because you can't know it all. And then finally, resorting back to the map territory analogy, one of the goals would be, in a general sense, to be able to make better maps of whatever territories that you experience through your life.